Okay guys, so spawning, just like with bullets, is essentially instantiating. Okay, so let's say that we are going to spawn our enemies in this room down here. Alright, so they'll spawn down here and we start off up here. So what we can do is we can create an empty game object, let's call it spawner. And this game object is going to need a script called spawner. Let's attach the spawner script to the spawner and open it up. So what we want this script to do is to actually instantiate enemies. So let's create a public game object enemy prefab. And we're going to use a function called spawn. So I'm going to make that public. So public void spawn. And by making it public, it means that we can actually call that function from other scripts. So this is where we're going to see the first instance of us reaching into another script. We've done it with a component, but this is going to be one that we're going to reach into this script from another script. Our game script, our game logic script, is going to reach in here and call this function spawn. Okay. So the public void spawn is going to take this enemy prefab and instantiate it. So game object enemy is equal to game object dot instantiate enemy prefab. Where do we want to instantiate it? We could say enemy dot transform dot position is equal to transform dot position. So wherever the spawner is, this is where the enemy is going to spawn from. And then something important, because when you instantiate objects, it actually gives the object a name, something, whatever the prefab is called, with brackets clone after it. So if you look up here, when I start shooting bullets, watch what happens. In here, when the bullets are instantiated, see it says bullet clone. Do you see that? We don't want that because we need to detect if we're hitting something called enemy, not enemy clone. So let's just change enemy dot name is equal to enemy, which is nice. Now we could have overcome this by actually tagging our enemy and just look for the tag instead. But this just gives you a little bit of insight on how you could actually modify, the names of certain things that are already tagged as something else. So it's like subsets. Right, so we've spawned that and away we go. Right, so the spawn function we're going to call from another game object called game logic. So we're looking through this list here. We've got spawning and game logic. They kind of go hand in hand. So let's add another empty game object called game logic. So this is going to take care of kind of like the more thinking part of your game. So stuff like scores, what state the game is in, have we started, are we finished, are we still playing, all that kind of stuff. So let's create that script now. Game logic. Note always, guys, and I hadn't mentioned this earlier, all of my scripts, the names are just one word. You can't have spaces in the name of your scripts, and the reason for that is if you look at game logic and you look in here, the name of the class has to be identical to the name of the file. Okay, so if you look right here, it says game logic, all the same. This has to be the same as well, so just bear that in mind for the future. That's something I should have put a note on at the start. Okay, so we got our game logic script. Let's attach that to our game logic. And this is going to reach into our spawner and call this public function right here. It's going to do it under certain circumstances. We're going to set those circumstances to be something very simple and straightforward for starters. So I'll open that up. And in here, we're going to say public spawner. So this is going to reach into our spawner, and let's call that spawner, lowercase. And we're going to use an invoke repeating function. This will happen every X amount of seconds. So you say invoke repeating let's call it create enemy. So that's going to be a function that we create. We'll do that after 3 seconds, and then every 3 seconds after that. These are really, really handy functions. So what it does is it's going to call this function, void create enemy, right? The create enemy function is in turn going to contact the spawner. So it's going to say spawner dot spawn, like so. So just to go through that again, we have a public spawner. So this would be a reference to this object here, which has the public function spawn inside it, which creates our enemy. It's going to speak to that, and then invoke repeating is going to create the enemy after 3 seconds, and then every 3 seconds after that, which in turn calls this function, which calls that spawn function on the spawner. Okay, so let's look at that. Now there is an error that we're going to have straight away, but I want you to understand why we have it, so I'm going to let that run out. So GameLogic needs a reference to our spawner. This is our spawner right here. Our spawner should probably be in a position that makes sense. Let's put that down here. So it should be, yeah, that's way too low. Where are we? There we go. So if you've got an empty game object like this, right? So here's an example of an empty game object that we're using just to hold a script. If you can't see it in your level, you can actually tag it with a color. So I'm going to put a red marker on that, and there you go. You can actually see the name of the game object there because it doesn't have anything to represent it in the world. So I'm going to put that red marker on there, and if you can't see it, you can make your gizmos bigger like that, just using this slider here. It's inside the gizmos call out there. So there's our spawner. It's going to be told by GameLogic to spawn every so often. Now this GameLogic can sit anywhere, it doesn't matter. Let's put it just up there. And the spawner itself needs a reference to our enemy prefab, which we do not have yet. So let's drag the existing enemy into our prefabs folder, which makes a prefab of it, and we'll switch off the one in our scene. And then our spawner needs that reference. Okay, cool. So let's see what happens next. And hit play. And we're waiting. Oh, there we go. So it just spawned an enemy. See that? And then look, it spawned another one. But we've got this error appearing down here, right? So look, unassigned reference exception. The variable player of enemy has not been assigned. And that makes sense because if you look at these enemies right here, scroll down to their enemy script. You remember in the previous tutorial, we had to drag the player reference into the enemy script so it would know who to chase. But these guys don't know because they're prefabs. And the problem with prefabs is, let's stop that from running. If you click on an enemy prefab and we open it up, if we try to assign the player in here, we can't do it because, well, first of all, it's a separate prefab. We can't reach into the actual game from this perspective. But because it's a prefab, it can't have an association with something that's already in the scene. So we need to get over that hump. The way I like to do that is to actually create a reference to the player inside the one thing that is in the game. So the spawner is in the game. Let's create a public GameObject. GameObject player. And then we've got a reference to our player now. This is inside the spawner. So let's drag the player reference into the spawner. Like so. So now the spawner knows about the player. And then we're going to get the spawner to tell the enemy about the player. just after it creates it. So enemy dot get component. This is how we get the enemy script from our enemy. So it's got the script on it, so we can say get component dot player, because it's public, is equal to player. So its player is equal to the player in this script, this one here. So from this point onwards, because our spawner knows about our player, it can tell any of the enemies that it creates about that player. Now what's this? Yeah, that's okay, that's the warning. Alright, so let's look at that in motion now. Okay, so now that's working. And if I move over this way, I wonder if it'll... Yeah, there. So now they're starting to surround me, as you can see. Luckily, I can shoot them. Cool. So it's good to see that's working. All right. So the cool thing about having a GameLogic script separate from your actual spawner is that you can then dictate when you want to actually spawn. So you can change the rules of your game, how it's going to work, you know, when you want to, what kind of waves you want to spawn, you know what's the conditions for spawning, say, you know, 10 new enemies or 10 new zombies or whatever. What reason would you have? So that's kind of cool. Right, so that takes care of our game logic and spawning just for now. In the next tutorial, we're going to look a little bit more in depth into the game logic itself, and we'll create a wave system. And then after that, we'll look at creating a user interface that will keep track of your health. We haven't actually looked at the player or the enemy attacking you yet, so we should probably say that if the enemy is within range, they're taking your health away because they're radioactive or something like that. And then we should represent that through the user interface.